From the earliest days of pro wrestling's history, there is a gay streak that runs right through the center. From its first steps out of sports and into entertainment, the squared circle has pulled from a multitude of theater traditions, from soap opera to vaudeville. What's less discussed is that from the very beginning, sports entertainment has historically borrowed significant pieces of gay culture. Historically speaking, most of the time pro wrestling has turned and used that culture to denigrate the very people from whom it took. As Heather Levi points to in her book, The World of Lucha Libre, Secrets, Revelations, and Mexican National Identity, it was as if they could point to the jeers and thereby confirm their masculinity. In the same show, a babyface could borrow elements of camp to get over, and then in the next match denigrate a character for being gay. And while this kind of behavior was probably at its peak in the 90s, it hasn't completely vanished from today's product. The irony isn't lost on queer workers like DJ Summers, and I quote, "It's interesting to me how many homophobic fans there are because you are watching sweaty men in their underwear fake fighting. If you're going to be homophobic, maybe watch something less homoerotic." Pro wrestling is a job, but it's also a lifestyle that often draws people that feel different. So perhaps it's not surprising that from the earliest days of sports entertainment, gay men and women have struck out into the world of wrestling to make their fortunes. Their journeys paved the way for the present. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the history of the LGBT community in professional wrestling. Much of the journalism regarding early figures can be spotty, as kayfabe and the closet have a lot in common when it comes to obscuring information. In the 50s and 60s, when homophobia was rampant, generally there is some evidence that the wrestling world was marginally more tolerant. If you could prove yourself a great wrestler or worker, that was more important. Pat Patterson may have come out on television in 2014, but he was out to the wrestling world by the 1970s. In that same period, Terry Garvin was always out, and is one of those rare gay wrestlers who used a gay gimmick. Typically, an LGBT gimmick will be used by a straight performer. These are all names that any casual fan will know, but once you scratch the surface, there are so many stories of queer men and women in wrestling's past. I want to share the stories of some lesser-known names. Their journeys are as varied as the finishers they used, but they all shared a dream of being successful at the things they loved. Alright, Mark, you ready to get worked? If you understood that sentence, you understand a linguistic tradition that is indivisible from gay culture.
Now, wait a minute, broski, I've heard that before. It's not gay culture. You're speaking carny.
You'd be correct. Sort of. Carnivals are a distinctly American venture, growing out of the very first Midway at the Columbia Exhibition, aka the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. The language spoken at carnivals by those who run them is much older. Sometimes called carny in the United States, it has its roots in Europe, mainly in England, where it's called Polari. In fact, there is some indication there were versions of Polari as far back as the 16th century. Often called a thieves' cant, Polari was a mix of Italian, rhyming slang, Romany, and Yiddish, and it was spoken by those who could benefit by not being understood. Often the communication form of choice for circus showmen, criminals, theater folk, and other marginalized groups such as gay folk and prostitutes. In fact, Polari was still heavily used within the gay subculture all the way up through the 1970s. David Bowie's album Black Star has an entire track in the cant. Gimmick, mark, work, smoz. All of these wrestling words arose from this strange melting pot of linguistic peculiarities used by showmen, gay folk, seamen, and thieves. In the world of lucha libre, a Mexican style of wrestling, there are the technicos, the babyfaces, the rudos, the heels, and the exoticos. Exoticos are a unique feature rooted in lucha libre. However, their influence can be felt around the world. These characters engage in performances that are a mix of wrestling and drag. the Exotico will come out in exaggerated feminized attire. Their physical fighting style integrates aspects of camp and vaudeville, subverting and often terrorizing their macho opponent. It's not uncommon for the Exotico to kiss their opponent as a form of attack, heavily playing into the fears of the machismo-focused Mexican culture. The very first Exotico was actually an American looking to use a different heel gimmick in Mexico. Yes, a Texan named Sterling Blake Davis is perhaps the very first Exotico. For most of his career, he was simply flamboyant. Hailing from Houston, Sterling worked the territory as Dizzy Davis. He chose bright, sparkling robes so that he could be identified in the dark and smoky ring. But it was when he went to Mexico in the mid-1930s when he brought out the high camp. He came out with a valet who sanitized the ring and distributed gardenias to all the women in the front row of the crowd. Then his butler would preen and massage him. This feminized display was the first time that we know of where a wrestler used queer coding. That is, engaging in behavior to make the audience perceive them as gay. But Sterling was a tough guy from Houston, and wouldn't bring the axe stateside. In fact, he was so confident the gimmick didn't have legs that by 1941, he essentially handed the entire thing over to childhood friend George Wagner, who used the gimmick all through the 1950s and into the 1960s. Wagner put his charisma to the gimmick with great success as the feminine Gorgeous George, who through television became one of the most famous people in the world. There is little debate that the cultural phenomenon known as the Exotico has international implications, not only in the wrestling industry, but in cultures at large. There are no sequined suits on James Brown, or the verbal flamboyance of Muhammad Ali without Gorgeous George. And you definitely don't have Gorgeous George without gay camp. Up until the 1980s, Exoticos claimed that their homosexuality was simply an act. In a world where kayfabe was still king, the fact that they were willing to admit that a gimmick existed demonstrates the perilous position that revealing one's sexual and gender orientation could put a performer in. In a world where good guys and bad guys wouldn't travel together, this was an outlier. Now, there is much debate as to who the first out Exotico was. Lucha Libre Grand Duchess Exotico Cassandro claims that it was the wrestler known as Baby Sharon. Others claim that May Flowers and Pimpernella Escarlata, who were tutored by Rudy Reynosa, take that title. No matter who was the first, however, the tide of openly gay performers has turned in some part due to the influence and staying power of the Exotico. Cassandro is considered by many to be an icon of the Exotico. Effie, whose own performances are rapidly becoming some of the most talked about in wrestling, stated the following in an interview. I'm still amazed that even within our own community, Cassandro doesn't get more outward love. As a queer performer, he was groundbreaking, and along with many other Exoticos, changed the perception of queers in wrestling by being so beloved, when typically we've been portrayed as heels that people are expected to hate because of their gayness. We'll get back to Effie a little later on in the video. It would be simplistic to say that the Exoticos simply give the masculine audience an opportunity to show how straight they are. It's tempting. Most Exotico matches have at least one moment where the performer or crowd takes an action that feels uncomfortably homophobic. But you also can't deny that many times the Exotico performer is very much over. The love from the crowd is palpable and undeniable, and maybe for some of them, it opened an internal door. There seems to be a growing space in all wrestling for men who are both feminine as well as athletic and tough. It seems the paradigm owes a great deal of debt to the Exotico. In the 1960s, the Rolling Stones concert at Altamont kicked off a period of a national obsession with the Hells Angels and motorcycle gangs. The Golden Boys, a blonde-haired tag team, was about to change their gimmick to something that would capitalize on that fear. They grew out their hair and wore black leather vests. They were the Hells Angels, the ultimate tough guys, and the audience loved the gimmick. Here was a pair of dangerous brothers from the open road ready to raise hell. But they weren't brothers. Unknown to the fans, but open in the locker room, Russell Groves and Chuck Harris, who went by Ron and Paul Dupree, were romantic partners. Though NWA promoter James Barnett Wrestler Pat Patterson and others were openly gay in the locker room, the Duprees were unusual by nature of also being a tag team. The two toured the territories, getting a reputation as ferocious heels, able to rise the ire of the crowd. There is something fascinating about a pair of gay lovers getting over with a tough-as-nails biker gimmick, though the leather element does have parallels in the gay community. Ron Dupree suffered an in-ring heart attack in 1970, transitioning to managing his partner and creating in-ring attire and entrance gear. One design that was noted by several sources was a Janis Joplin robe for his partner who was obsessed with the singer. 5 years later, while doing commentary, he had a second heart attack and unfortunately passed away. Many of his friends felt that Paul Dupree never truly recovered from his partner's death. He took on the name Chris Colt and began to use a rock and roll type gimmick, painting his eyes in a way that calls to mind more Norwegian black metal than Alice Cooper, who he was imitating. He took huge bumps, and though he'd always been a prolific user, he started leaning even more heavily on drugs. According to Roddy Piper's biography, he was once high on who knows what, wrestled a cage match at the Phoenix Madison Square Garden while he was hallucinating spiders scuttling all over the cage. He fought fans and security as he ran out of the arena. Lanny Poffo, brother of Randy Poffo, who a lot of you may know as the Macho Man Randy Savage, was Colt's tag team partner in Detroit in the late 1970s, and he was quoted as saying, "Chris Colt was probably the greatest wrestler that never made it. A lot of people don't know who he was. He never ceased to amaze me with his imagination in the ring. He was an innovator. He was ahead of his time." Colt wrestled into the 80s, continuing to take crazy bumps to put over young baby faces. Like many wrestlers, he worked long after his body begged to be retired. Adrift without his partner Ron, at the end of his life, he was involved in gay pornography. Friends lost track of him, but then he resurfaced in Seattle, a born-again Christian. After a strange, nomadic life that was as unique as he was, Chris Colt passed away in 1996. Sandy Parker was the first ever out black lesbian wrestler. She couldn't possibly have been more of a trailblazer. A tomboy raised by her mother and grandmother, Sandy was once married to a man before coming out as a lesbian. Working under her real name after a check written to a wrestling pseudonym wouldn't cash, she traveled the country as tag team champions with Sue Green. A Canadian by birth, Sandy Parker worked as many territories as she could. She even stood up to the notorious Fabulous Moolah. Sandy hated that Moolah took such a significant cut from the girls' check. Moolah forbade Sandy from going to gay bars and tried to force her to date her nephew. Sandy had enough, especially since Moolah also had her fair share of sexual encounters with female wrestlers. Sandy couldn't put up with the two-facedness. In a move that many women couldn't manage, Sandy left Moolah to work for Mildred Burke. Parker played the heel for most of her career. A 1975 article about the return of women's wrestling to Oregon describes her mercilessly slapping a ref throughout the match. She then worked in Japan for a spell before returning to the US, where she wrestled until her retirement in 1986. DJ Summers explains, "This is why queer workers as a whole enjoy women's wrestling so much, because they have fought for their spot. They have put in the blood, sweat, and tears. We have something to prove to the higher-ups and to the fans." Being both gay as well as black, Sandy fought hard for every step forward she made, blazing a trail for those who would follow her. It seems Sandy Parker lives a quiet life today. After she retired from wrestling, she worked as a bartender, a store manager, and a security guard. A 2004 Cauliflower Alley honoree, Sandy has little love for the booking of today, and the bluntness and honesty that made her famous is still on full display. And I quote, "As far as I'm concerned, wrestling is crap now. I give the guys credit for some of the things they do, some of the high spots and the falls, but I do not give them credit for the stupid storylines that they have." Preach, sister, preach. The AIDS panic pushed many wrestlers back into the closet, but in a sport as blood-soaked as wrestling, the effects were even more dramatic. In the 80s, 90s, and even into the early 2000s, there seemed to be a distinct lack of out gay wrestlers. Strangely, this seemed to coincide with a huge uptick in queer-coded characters and storylines. Most of the men and women involved in these storylines were heterosexual, using things that seemed gay to get a rise out of the audience. Perhaps it was a cultural pushback from the AIDS crisis, or maybe because they'd run out of ideas and ways to shock people. Now, if it seems that the bookers and wrestlers often had little idea about the people and culture they were borrowing from, it's because it's true. Dustin Reynolds, better known as Goldust, had the character pitched to him as androgynous by Vince McMahon. He agreed to the part, but after hanging up the phone, he had to go look up what the word androgynous meant. Matches like the one against Razor Ramon and Roddy Piper invited Goldust to be humiliated or humiliate others with his portrayed queerness, simultaneously weaponizing it and presenting it as a weakness. There was even a moment in time where Reynolds contemplated getting breast implants to further push the envelope with his character, because wrestling is f***ing insane. When that gimmick went stale, they had his wife, Terry Reynolds, valet for him as Marlena. With her sexy figure and giant phallic cigar, they tried to backpedal on his homosexuality while continuing to subvert gender roles. There were other moments from this era that continued to villainize gay people. Billy Gunn and Chuck Palumbo began a simultaneous gay and heel turn that culminated in an in-ring wedding in 2002. Though just before the nuptials were to occur, they admitted it had been a publicity stunt, and after a beatdown from 3 Minute Warning, they went back to being straight heroes. But there were some victories. After WCW premiered Lenny Lane and Lodi as the West Hollywood Blondes, characters designed to be homophobia magnets, GLAAD and other groups reached out and asked that the characters be removed as they felt they invited gay bashing. The Washington Post claims that this was the final misstep that made Ted Turner pull the reins from Eric Bischoff creatively. Lesbians didn't escape the poor representation either. Though lesbianism was often seen as a way of titillating the crowd, like Kimona Wanalea and Beulah McGillicuddy's lesbian angle in ECW, it could also be used to inspire fear. For example, the infamous Trish Stratus, Mickie James stalker angle. Instead of simply relying on obsession or madness, the booking required Mickie to become an obsessive lesbian. Unable to control her unnatural sexual desires, they ultimately erupted in violence. Thankfully, it seems that both in terms of wrestlers' personal lives and storylines, things are shifting. In 2020, we have out wrestlers like Sonya Deville and Darren Young, where little is made of their sexuality, and the focus remains on their fighting styles, as it should be. Residing in Tallahassee, Florida, Effie, born Taylor Gibson, is one of the few openly queer pro wrestlers currently working in the industry today. He's held multiple championships and is gaining a steady fan base and respect from his peers. Effie is out to prove that there's a place in the business for the LGBTQ people and provide legitimacy to a frequently disrespected medium along the way. In an interview with Intomore.com, Effie stated the following: "Wrestling is the last form of improvisational physical theater, and it is pure art. Literally, wrestling is drag. It's over-the-top exaggeration. Obviously, for queens, it's exaggeration of femininity, and on our end, it's masculinity. Where I've taken my character, I've played with both ends of that. They say, oh, here's this boy in fishnets, and then I beat people's asses." Effie's journey to wrestling was one of self-discovery. After dealing with assorted substance abuse problems, Gibson discovered new purpose and a clearer sense of his own identity through the intense physical pain of the squared circle. "I was drinking all the time, I was smoking weed all day, every day. I was doing whatever pills I could get my hands on. I didn't usually say no to anything. One day, I took like 8 hits of LSD, went mental in my house, ended up in the hospital, and went stone cold sober from there. I was like, hold on, you gotta do something with your time." Turns out, getting hit in the face is probably twice as fun as getting drunk. And it was through the creation of the character of Effie and newfound sobriety that the performer began to come to terms with his own sexual identity. "When I got sober, that was the first time I'd come out to my parents. They're really cool with it now, but at the time I had to find the confidence. In the wrestling world, the character has always been queer. I was struggling to find out who I really was. In college, I was fucking some dudes. fucking some chicks, but it was never a public thing that I owned. Once I had the Effie attitude, it was like discovering myself for the first time. I hate the term pansexual, but it's probably the most accurate. I'm currently in a monogamous relationship with a man. Although the character of Effie and his real-life identity were originally envisioned as separate, Effie now sees how the two have become increasingly entangled. In real life, I'm a normal guy. I'm working at a moving company and I'm running a business, and then I become this character, and I see pieces of Effie slipping into the way I handle business or customer service. I see the business side slipping into how I handle myself getting booked or appearances. I've become this one big, messy, cloudy murkiness of Effie and Taylor. But Effie hopes that with his openness and presentation, it helps inspire a new generation of both viewers and rising stars. I'm the queer Stone Cold Steve Austin. I'm an ass kicker. I don't give a fuck. I'm fully unapologetic with my character, not to make myself sound like some soldier of queer change, but in a lot of cases, there are fans who wouldn't feel comfortable cheering for me, but once they see that I can take the hate and the vitriol, they get this confidence in them too. If he can handle it, I can handle it too. It's really exciting to see, especially in a town that, voted for Trump. We now have the opportunity for a queer wrestler to be probably the biggest star in the world. People are looking to a lot of queer heroes and LGBTQ stars as voices that are more powerful because we've dealt with shit and we're not taking it anymore. Even a straight audience can connect with that. Thank you guys so much for watching this episode of It's Still Real to Them. Researching this video was a lot of fun for me. Usually I'm pretty knowledgeable about the topics I cover in this series, but I have to admit the history of the LGBT community in wrestling was something I didn't know too much about. In next week's video, we'll be taking a look at some of the LGBTQ promotions and the people involved with them. If you enjoyed the video and the things that I do here on the channel, and you'd like to see these videos a little bit early, consider signing up to the Patreon. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you in the next one.